This is History of Ancient Rome at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. So now that we're diving into the actual history here, we're beginning with a discussion not of Rome itself, but of Italy. Its kind of broader geographic context. This is necessary because Rome, of course, is not the whole of Italy. It begins as one settlement, eventually one city-state, and comes over many centuries to dominate the Italian peninsula. But it does so in a way that, as we'll see, it borrows a great deal from the other peoples of Italy. And so we need to account for those people and sort of the cultural contributions they made to ancient Italy. We also need to talk about the Greeks because they not only settled major parts of Italy, but Rome, borrowed a tremendous amount from the shared Mediterranean culture that was dominated by the Greeks for many centuries. The Greeks were far more advanced early on than the peoples of Italy. By contrast, and the Greeks certainly saw them this way, by contrast, the peoples of Italy were kind of country bumpkins. And that's an important part of the identity of the Romans. They, even when they became the dominant force in the Mediterranean and in the broader kind of Western world, they still thought of themselves in that way as having emerged from this rural, pastoral setting, and they saw themselves as better for all of that, as kind of. One of the secrets of their success in the Roman view was that they kept in touch with their roots. And so, whether that's a facade or not, and I think it is in large part a facade, but whether that's a facade, we still need to have some sense of the roots in early Italy. And so first let's account for the geography of Italy. This is a tremendously important component of what comes to shape Rome and Italy more broadly. You'll see here that Rome is on the western coast, inland a few miles, maybe 20, 30 miles. I can't remember exactly how far this is from the coast. There's a port right on the coast called Ostia, and that becomes Rome's entryway into the Mediterranean Sea. And Rome, of course, rests right on the Tiber River, which is a significant river, but not one of the larger rivers in Europe by any means. But it is, of course, an important source of water, irrigation, things like that for the Romans. And the plain that Rome is on is called Latium. This is where we get the name of the language the Romans speak, which is Latin. It is one of three plains on the western side of Italy. The northern plain is called Etruria, or modern-day Tuscany, the principal city of Tuscany. Kind of in more recent centuries is Florence, especially in the Italian Renaissance. But anciently, this whole plain was dominated by a people called the Etruscans, and in the next video lecture, we'll have a few things to say about the Etruscans because they're a really important people for the formation of Roman culture. Then Latium is the middle plain, and then south of that, where Naples is a plain called Campania. You can see the Campanian name here as part of the Apennine mountain range. But Campania. And here we see a contact zone between the Italic peoples and the Greek peoples coming from over here in the Balkan Peninsula. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. One geographic feature that we should note here is that Italy is formed by volcanic eruptions, or I should say it was millions of years ago formed by volcanic eruptions of a chain of volcanoes that are now mostly extinct. There are still a couple of active ones in the Mediterranean, Mount Vesuvius being the most prominent one, and we'll talk about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE that destroyed the city of Pompeii. later on in the term. But this mountain range called the Apennines runs the length of the peninsula down into the toe of the boot here, and even across the Strait of Messina into Sicily here. Right, this is all part of one mountain range. And this is a imposing physical barrier that cuts off, not entirely cuts off, there are lots of passes, there are ways through the mountain range, but it separates these plains on the western side of Italy from the coastlands on the eastern and southern parts of Italy, as well as the Po River Valley here in the north. And so anciently, and we're talking about, back into the Bronze Age, into the second and even third millennia BCE, there were various peoples who inhabited, or I should say settled, Italy. We don't have a great sense of this because we rely entirely on material remains for this, and that can only tell us so much. But this geographic feature of the Apennine Mountains is important because it means that different peoples develop their own cultures, even their own languages. So Italy is quite complex in that regard. It's Rome, ultimately, that brings all of these peoples together under a single banner, a single ethnic and linguistic identity, but some of the separateness, some of the variety remains in the identities of people, even into the Roman Republic and Empire. So we'll discuss that. North of the Apennines here, we have the most significant river of Italy, the Po River. The Po River was quite it's colder up here in northern Italy because you're getting into the region of the Alps, and so the winters are longer, the growing season's shorter than you would find here down in central Italy or down in southern Italy or Sicily, where it's much hotter, where the growing seasons are longer. Over many centuries, many millennia, in fact, human beings did gradually drain the swamps that characterized the region of the Po River Valley and created good agricultural land to the point that the Po River Valley becomes a pretty productive center. But this is an important contact zone here between the peoples of northern Italy and the Alpine region and the peoples of kind of central and southern Italy, especially the Etruscans. And so we'll discuss this contact zone here. One other thing that we should note is that because Italy was formed by volcanic eruptions, volcanic ash tends to be an important component of the soil, which makes the soil very rich. Italy is a productive agricultural land. It was anciently. The soil is not difficult to work. It doesn't have, it's light. It's easy to use a fairly simple plow made up of just kind of a sharpened branch of some kind. And to turn over that soil, to work it up to the point where it can, be planted with seeds. And so that volcanic ash is a major factor in the population density of Italy. North of Italy is cut off from most of the rest of what is now Europe by the Alps, the most imposing mountain range in Europe. And the Alps extends down here into the Balkan Peninsula, this region which was anciently called Dalmatia, where the name of the dog comes from, now called Croatia, right? Or I guess we get down into other modern nations here, but Dalmatia corresponds roughly with the modern nation of Croatia. And the culture of Italy extends to a great extent into the Balkans as well. But we start to get into the Greek-speaking peoples down here, and we should not think of a hard and fast division between Italy and Greece. You can see how close they are. I mean, there's a small strait called the Strait of Otranto, I should say. Down here in the heel of separating the heel of the boot from what is essentially northern Greece, right? And it's an easy passage across that strait, and so there's a lot of commerce, a lot of migration, things like that across that strait. Southern Italy is much closer to Greece than it is to, say, Rome, right, or to the Po River Valley or something like that. Also in the Italian orbit, of course, are Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, these islands, and they're going to play a significant role in Roman history too. So hopefully that captures most of what I wanted to say here about geography. I want to talk about the peoples of Italy here in a few minutes. Prehistory is really before about 800 BCE, and by prehistory we mean before the advent of writing in Italy. We only have writing starting about 800 BCE, and then, not in any great volume for at least a few centuries. We saw in the discussion of sources that we really don't have works of history, for instance, until probably the 3rd century BCE, so writing had been around for 500 years or so in Italy up to that point. Contrast this with the Greeks, who, already have epic poetry by about 750 BCE. The 2 epic poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, date to about that point, as well as the great author Hesiod is also a late 8th or early 7th century BCE figure. There's nothing equivalent to that in Italy, right? We rely mostly on material culture, even into the historical period, as it's called. And so what do we learn about prehistory here? About, Italy in the time before writing, or the time before writing becomes quite common. Well, one of the most significant sites that's been uncovered, and you can see a piece of pottery that comes from the so-called Villanovan culture. There's a site near Bologna called Villanova, and this is where that name comes from. There's evidence here that by about 1000 BCE, the Villanovans, which is a kind of generic term for the peoples of Italy, the Po River Valley extending down into the Apennine region, these early italic peoples, right? If they're using iron about 1000 BCE, this is roughly around the time that maybe a little bit after when iron comes into usage more generally in the eastern Mediterranean, so it seems to have diffused into Italy, probably by migration rather than by commerce and trade, though there may have been some of both going on. One of the most significant things that we find in the material remains is, of course, burial practices. And there's a difference here between different peoples. This is one of the ways to distinguish these prehistoric peoples of Italy. Some people, and this is especially in the north, in the Po River Valley, in the regions extending down into the northern Apennine range, as well as in Etruria and even to some extent in Latium, burials are done by, I shouldn't say burials, human remains are cremated. And so this thing that you're seeing here is an urn, a Villanovan urn. When you get a bit south of Rome, if we go back to the map here, there's kind of a line here, about right here, where prehistory shows that north of that line, the Villanovan peoples were cremating their dead. South of that line, the peoples of Italy were practicing inhumation. That means they were burying their dead. This is especially the case in Sicily, but even to some extent up here. Now, why the difference? Well, this may mean that different peoples immigrated into Italy, some of whom had the common practice of cremation, others of whom tended to bury their dead. The burials may have been, or I should say the burial people may have been earlier, but all of that is to some extent speculation. And so by 750 BCE or so, Villanovan peoples seem to be doing both. Now, this probably means that some of the people who practiced cremation took up the practice of burial, probably borrowing it from their neighbors. And so we find settlements, even some fairly close to each other, where we have on the one hand people who cremate, and then fairly close we have people who practice inhumation. I should say burials tend to be some of the most common material remains that we find, because care of the dead seems to be a pretty common thing among human societies, and of course burials, if they're accompanied by material remains that will not deteriorate over time, things like pottery, they are especially if they're buried in the ground, right, they tend to be preserved fairly well. But that, that doesn't mean that these people were necessarily obsessed with funerary culture or anything like that. It's just what we have at our disposal. One thing that we have to account for here is a distinction between linguistic groups. The italic languages, and by this we mean especially Latin, but there were different italic languages previous to Roman Latin. Some elements of each of these were incorporated into the Latin the Romans would come to speak. We have the Oscan languages of the Apennine region, the Veneti and Apuli languages of southern and kind of eastern Italy. And these are all variations, they're dialects of the Italic tongue. These are all Indo-European. Now, if you're not familiar with this term, the Indo-European language family is one of the most prolific in the world. There are hundreds of different Indo-European, maybe hundreds isn't quite the appropriate. I think there are at least a couple hundred Indo-European tongues, maybe more than that. I should have looked this up to find the kind of better number than this, but all of the languages of Europe, with a couple of exceptions, are Indo-European. Many of the languages of the Middle East and of South Asia, of the Indian subcontinent, are Indo-European. Writing systems to capture the phonetic elements of Indo-European languages like Sanskrit and Greek, the Cyrillic alphabet, right? Eventually the Roman alphabet, right? These are all associated with Indo-European languages. Major branches of Indo-European include the italic languages, which would mean not only Latin, but also the outgrowths of Latin, the Romance languages like French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, and the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, the Celtic languages, as well as things like the Persian language, which is spoken, what's now called Farsi, spoken in Iran, and as I said, many of the languages of the Italian or the Indian subcontinent. And so, the Indo-European language family is massive. It's spreads across a wide swath of the world. But earlier, and the introduction of Indo-European languages into Italy seems to have been via migration. That as Indo-European people spread out from what seems to have been the origin point of the Indo-European languages, this would be somewhere in the region of the Caucasus, or possibly down into what is now Turkey or Syria. The Indo-European speaking people spread both east and west from there. Back, we're talking 3rd millennium, maybe 4th millennium BCE or something like that the spread began. Indo-European speakers arrived in the Mediterranean, and they developed the Greek language. And then at some point, they arrived in Italy, and the outgrowths were the Italic languages and eventually Latin, right? But they found there peoples who had arrived before who did not speak Indo-European languages. The most prominent example of this would be the Etruscans. And we'll talk more about the Etruscans in the next video lecture, but they're a significant people, as I said. Now, were the Etruscans the original inhabitants of Italy? Well, when we're talking about prehistory, there's nothing certain. There are two major hypotheses. One is that they were the indigenous peoples of Italy, and that they had been there for a very long time before the Indo-European speakers arrived. Did they immigrate there? At some point in the distant past? Well, I would assume so. Given what we know about human development and human evolution and things like this, that they were not sort of created there or anything like that, right? But when that happened is a source of debate. Some argue that the Etruscans had an Asian origin, and that they arrived shortly before the Indo-European speakers, possibly in the third millennium, or maybe the early second millennium BCE, something like that, right? The important point to take away from this is that there is a diversity of languages, right, in prehistoric Italy. And that diversity of languages remains the case even into historic Italy. That the Etruscan language is still in wide use for many centuries. Some Romans were even quite fascinated with the Etruscan language. We'll talk about the Emperor Claudius, for instance, who was a scholar of Etruscan, wrote a great deal about this. Unfortunately, his works have not survived. But this means a kind of clash of peoples in prehistoric Italy, and probably also cooperation, right? So almost certainly there was tension and warfare between these various peoples, but also to some extent cooperation and sharing of culture and things like this. Here's a map of the different peoples of Italy. This doesn't capture everybody, but let me just mention a few of the important ones. We have here in the central region, everything in the greenish color here, right? These are the italic peoples. This would include the people of Rome, but extending all through Latium here and down into Campania, as well as groups that we will discuss, like the Sabines or the Umbrians, or especially the Samnites, the people of central Italy here, and they were mountain people or hill people of the Apennine region, and they're going to be really important to Roman history. On the eastern side of Italy, both in the south and in the north, we have these people called the Veneti. This is actually where the word Venice comes from, though Venice is not founded until much, much later. Not until the kind of late antiquity do we have the establishment of Venice, because Venice was, of course, just a swamp, and it still is to some extent. More and more with global warming, unfortunately. Then we have the Etruscans here, right? And I mentioned these are non IndoEuropean speakers. Their region extended from the Po Valley down through the Arno River Valley, where Florence is, and down into the region of Rome. They would eventually incorporate Rome into a broader kingdom, which we'll talk about later on. So the Etruscans are an important people. They dominated a whole swath of Italy. In the northern part of Italy, we have these people called the Ligurians, who their origins are somewhat unknown, and they did not ever produce any writing, it seems. The mentions we have of Ligurians in written sources suggest that they were farmers, quite hardy, that they were short and stocky for the most part, that they were kind of enslaved or dominated by the Etruscans, but that the Ligurians were a very hardy people, and the Roman authors who discuss them tend to praise them for that hardiness and kind of earthiness that they had, and so the Ligurians are one we want to be aware of, at least. Originally from this kind of northern Italian region, the western part of the Po Valley. There was also another group in the Po Valley called the Ratians, who may have been related to the Etruscans, but were pushed out of the Po Valley by the Etruscans, probably into the Alpine region. You can see the color orange here, which represent the Ratians. Down here in southern Italy, as mentioned, there were lots of Greek settlements, and we'll talk about those places like Tarentum and Cumae and Croton and Syracuse and Sicily. Right, these become major Greek polis or city-states, and the Romans would eventually, come into contact and conflict with them. Cumae, for instance, was an important place not only as a port but also as a religious center. And the Greeks had some presence as well, it seems, in Latium, close to Rome, and would influence Roman culture. Down here in the kind of light orange color, we have the Carthaginians, right? And Carthage itself was a city-state founded by Phoenician merchants, probably around the beginning of the Iron Age, 1000 BCE or so. And the Carthaginians would eventually dominate the coastlands of Corsica, Sardinia, and western Sicily. And, this is the Carthaginians, of course, are going to be the chief rival of Rome in the Republican period, and eventually we're going to see 3 wars fought between these two peoples. Okay, so I think that captures the majority of the peoples of Italy here. Let me talk just briefly about the Italians, and in the next video lecture we'll talk about the Etruscans and the Greeks. So the Italic peoples, and again by that we mean the peoples of kind of central Italy down here into the western coast, over into Latium and Campania, but also up here into this region called Umbria, kind of the eastern coast here, and down into the bottom part of the boot, right? The Samnites and others. Okay. They were split between communities that practiced agriculture. These are mostly on the coast, but to some extent they were able to do agriculture even in the mountains. And pastoralists. There were some mixed economies for sure. It wasn't a total divide here, but the mountain peoples tended to rely more on pastoralism because the mountain ranges present physical challenges to agriculture, and the peoples of the plains, of course, did more agriculture, right? What kind of pastoralism? Probably sheep and goats more than anything, although they do have cows and chickens and other domesticated animals, but sheep and goats tend to be the most common, especially in the mountains. Very wealthy elite kind of figures in these societies probably would have owned cattle, but the standard pastoralist would have had a herd of sheep or a herd of goats. Especially in the mountain regions, but even to some extent on the coastlands, there were always population pressures. Crop yields were not great in the ancient world. One seed planted only produces 3, and you have to save one of those to plant next year's crops, right? And so they're not getting a lot of yield from planting seeds in the ground. So there was always pressure to relieve the kind of the population in some ways. The major mechanisms to do this were colonization and the practice called the sacred spring, which is related to colonization. So by colonization we mean that periodically settlements would send out part of their population to go and found a new settlement. And often this created a relationship of mutual dependency, at least for a while, but colonies eventually became more and more independent from the mother settlement, as it were. There was a practice, and this was backed by religion in many places, a practice called sacred spring. This is where a community would designate a springtime, or even a whole year, but it started in the spring, where all of the people, all of the babies born that spring or that year, and this included not only this would include in some cases even animals, but we're talking mostly about human population here. They would be designated for sacrifice. And I don't mean human sacrifice, although some people did practice human sacrifice of their enemies whom they bested in war. But sacrifice in the sense that they would be raised apart from the rest of the community, or they would be distinguished from other children, right? And when they came of age, they would be sent out to go somewhere else and found a new colony. And this wasn't necessarily a regular thing, meaning they didn't do this every 20 years or anything like that. It was sort of like whenever the population pressure was reaching a kind of crisis point, they would declare a sacred spring. This was usually again, backed by the religion, backed by the priests of the various cults, that they would say this was the will of the gods. And this is a way of making sure that the population never rises above a certain level that would be impossible to sustain. Sacred spring was a custom not only in Italy, but also in Greece and other places. So this is a kind of shared Mediterranean institution. The most cohesive of all of the Italic peoples, arguably in this early period were the Samnites. And again, the Samnites were this mountain people living in the Apennine region. That said, there is a lot of evidence that the Samnites were a kind of collection of warring groups, warring settlements who fought frequently with each other. But they did eventually organize into what they called the Samnite League. And this was primarily a defensive alliance between different Samnite groups. The Samnite League would be important when Rome began to expand into the Apennine region, that the Samnites came together and sent the Romans packing a couple of times and the Romans kept coming back. And so we'll talk about the Samnite Wars later on. These are key to the early development of Rome, right? Had those gone a different way, then Western civilization would have had a very different history. The Samnites also contributed a great deal to the broader culture of Italy. For instance, in their gods whom they worshipped, they, like other Italian peoples, it seems, had a particular affinity for the god Mamers, whose name is eventually shortened to Mars by the Romans. But Mamers was a war god, but also an agricultural god. And Mamers was the one whose will was met in the practice of sacred spring, right? So they would kind of back this by saying this is a decree of Mamers. The Samnites also practiced divination, which was common in Italy, especially by looking at the flights of birds. Birds were thought to be messengers from the gods, and so they would watch the way they flew and the patterns that they flew in. They would listen to their cries and things like this, and by that, those who were trained in divination could divine what the gods wanted them to do, right? And so this will eventually become a key component of Roman religion, and the early Romans probably did practice this, but this was shared, and we find a great deal of evidence of this among the Samnites, that part of their cohesion was in the practice of things like divination and in the worship of Mamers, that they found unity in these things, so to speak. All of the peoples of Italy were organized by kinship, to a greater or lesser extent anyway. A large kinship group tends to go under the title tribe, and without all of the negative connotations, right? When we describe tribal peoples, we tend to think of people who live a primitive existence, something like that. That's not what I'm talking about here. Tribe is a kind of technical term for large kinship group, where people perceive, even if this is not necessarily reality, perceive that they are related by blood. All descending from a distant ancestor who is probably the figure of the mythology of the tribe. If you think about, for instance, the legends of Abraham and the other early Hebrew prophets, right? This is kind of tribal mythology that leads to the conclusion that we're all related to each other, descending from this heroic ancestor, right? That's, of course, a Semitic group, the Hebrews. But we can also see this, another example would be the legends about Theseus, the supposed kind of founder of Athens, right? That all of the peoples of Athens claim descent from Theseus and from his companions. And so, we have this relationship, even if we can't necessarily trace our blood relationship with each other. A clan, on the other hand, is smaller. And in this case, it probably is possible to understand exactly the blood relationship, right? That, you could look at any member of a clan and say, that guy is my third cousin, or, he is my my sister's husband's brother's father, or I guess that would make sister's husband's father. Anyway, you can the exact relationship there, right? And this contributes to the standard naming practices among the Italian peoples. That all of the italic groups tended to have what's called the praenomen, which is what we would call the first name, but then also the nomen, which just means name in Latin, which corresponds with the clan. Now, some of the italic groups also had what's known as the cognomen, which would be associated with their tribal name. Now, by the time we get to the Republican period, tribal names tended to be linked to places rather than mythologies or these notions of blood relationships. But that's an outgrowth of this earlier practice, right? So when we talk about elite Romans having three names, like Gaius Julius Caesar, for instance, or Marcus Tullius Cicero, we see there the praenomen Gaius, the nomen Julius, and the cognomen, which is Caesar, right? The praenomen just being their given name, the clan name as the nomen, Julius, and then the tribe name, which would be Caesar or Cicero, or one of these names. So that's common among all of the Italians, and the Romans get these things from that shared culture. Religion. The shared culture of the Italians held that the gods were anthropomorphic. They existed in human form. They have a kind of shared pantheon among all of the italic groups. Jupiter is the sky god, and that's shared not only with the italics but also with the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. Jupiter may be the name Zeus, I should say, is related to Jupiter. If you just take the JUP, right, that is of the same Indo-European root as Zeus, and then the Piter is actually the word father, pater, right? So Zeus pater, right, becomes Jupiter, Jupiter in the italic languages, whereas it stays as Zeus pater in Greek. And so, this is, again, shared across the Mediterranean. Among the italics, though, Jupiter was a common god, the sky god, the father god. Mamers was also, as I said, a very important god. In addition to that, many of the italic peoples, maybe all of them, worshipped the goddess Diana, who was associated with things like the moon and the countryside and hunting. She was the female goddess counterpart of Mamers, who governed things like warfare and agriculture. Diana was the kind of wild side of the people, maybe the pastoralist side, and Mamers was the settled side, the agricultural side, but also the side that meant that they were engaged in warfare over those things. Divination was common among all of the peoples of Italy, though other forms of divination seem to have come from the Etruscans, and we'll talk about that when we discuss the Etruscans next time. It was also common to practice sacrifice, in some cases even human sacrifice. So when they went to war, it was more common to try to, even if you were losing the battle, because the chances are if you get captured, you're going to be sacrificed, right? To have a kind of heroic departure from this life. That's preferable to being caught and being sacrificed to your rival's gods. But sacrifice was not only of humans. In fact, that wasn't the primary form of sacrifice. Sacrifice of animals, and even of things like drink, right, of wine, that they would pour out wine onto the ground, to the gods as an offering. They did this with animals. They would burn them for the gods. They gave food offerings of things like grains as well, right? So sacrifice is a tremendously important part of the early worship of these deities, and various rituals as well. And these rituals will crystallize over time and become essential components of Roman culture. Okay, so hopefully that gives us starts to give us a sense of the culture that's developing in Italy. Next time we will discuss the